Hello and welcome everyone. Thank you for joining today's webinar on approaches to land conservation in Africa, the case of OECMs and West Africa. This is the second webinar in a series of 3 webinars the ILCN is hosting in the lead up to the first Africa Protected Areas Congress, which is scheduled for July of this year in Kigali, Rwanda, where some of you may be traveling in July. As participants continue to join, and before we get started, I just wanted to share a brief overview of how this session will work. The webinar will begin shortly with introductory remarks, followed by presentations from our 3 speakers. We encourage you to send in your questions as they arise throughout the course of the webinar using the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. Once the presentations have concluded, presenters will address your questions during the Q&A session. That will be the last 30 minutes of our time together. Please do not use the chat function to send us your questions, although you should use the chat box for any comments, feedback, or other communications you might have with us, and to see or share relevant links. Finally, as always, a recording of this webinar will be available on our website at landconservationnetwork.org within the next few days if you have colleagues who may be interested in this topic, or if you'd like to revisit any of the presentations. With that, I'll turn it over to Jim Levitt, Director of the International Land Conservation Network, and Kiragu Mwangi, ILCN's Regional Representative for Africa, to begin the webinar with their opening remarks.
Good morning, as it is in Cambridge, Massachusetts, and Belmont, Massachusetts, where I'm sitting right now. It's a beautiful, crisp day here, and I'm so happy to be able to introduce to you a very knowledgeable panel to discuss approaches to land conservation in Africa, the case of OECMs and West Africa. And I just want to make the brief comment before we start that the volume of thought and innovation that appears to be emerging in the land conservation community of practice is really astounding. I had the privilege of being able to travel to Barcelona last week to attend the meeting of the European Land Conservation Network, Eurosite, and the European Landowners Organization, and just picked up a huge amount of enthusiasm and speeding up of the pace of land conservation activities across that continent. And now we have the privilege of being with 3 experts or really 4 experts who are very knowledgeable about Africa. So with that, let me introduce my friend, Mike Kiragu Mwangi, who is ILCN's Africa Regional Representative and the director of a consulting firm, which he runs, called Earth Positive Consulting Limited. Kiragu, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Jim, and great to be here. I am delighted that we have an opportunity to sit together and have a conversation today with our distinguished guests in the names of Michael Garbo, Executive Director of Society for Conservation of Nature in Liberia, Daniel Maranvik, who is a Program Officer for IUCN's Green List of Protected Areas in the East and Southern African Office, and Kathleen Fitzgerald, who currently works for the Pew Charitable Trust on project finance for permanence. I am delighted to be part of these 3 series webinars that are highlighting approaches and progress in land conservation in Africa. And before we get going with our guests, I would like to make an observation of some of the things that are happening in the continent as a way of setting the scene. I've been engaged in this role for ILCN in the last 1.5 years, and I've been quite energized to see what's going on in the continent, to learn a few things, as well as be motivated and inspired to do even more to facilitate the good people who are driving this work on the ground. But the context here is that all indications are that the world is falling short to meet the targets that were set under the Aichi targets. especially Goal B, which is about reducing pressures on biodiversity and promoting sustainable use. The state of nature is still in crisis, and this has brought a sharper focus in Africa due to the variety of challenges that we see. We all know that Africa is immensely rich in living in biodiversity. Its living organisms comprise around a quarter of the global biodiversity and supports the Earth's largest assemblages of large animals which roam freely in many countries. Africa's 9 biomes extend from mangroves, deserts, from the Mediterranean to the tropical forests, from temperate to subtropical and montane grasslands and savanna, and even ice-capped mountains. There are many examples of successes and innovation in the conservation of Africa's biodiversity, yet Africa is still experiencing unprecedented rates of population growth, urbanization, and agricultural developments, which create immense challenges in reconciling human well-being with environmental and economic prosperity. We have seen reports, for example, from the UN Population Fund suggesting that the population of Africa has doubled since 1990 from 640 million to about 1.3 billion by 2021, and it's projected to double again to 2.5 billion by 2050. So, as signatories of the Convention for Biological Diversity, African governments will be minded to partner with countries, communities rather, and civic organizations, as well as private landowners who are keen to protect land for nature, such that to help add to the national targets to protect at least 17% of terrestrial areas and inland and waters, and 10% of coastal marine areas, as well as moving towards achieving the 30 by 30 goal. So this webinar is about facilitating knowledge share on how key stakeholders in Africa are helping in this role of facilitating land conservation and the current approaches used in Africa. I'm very pleased that we are now going to hear what's happening in West Africa through Liberia, and we'll also hear about the innovative ways of using other effective area-based conservation measures as well. And we'll learn from Kathleen some of the innovative ways of raising resources to do or to achieve these goals. So without much further ado, I'd like to introduce our first speaker. I'll introduce Michael F. Garbo, who's the Director of Society for the Conservation of Nature in Liberia. Michael is a well-known lead Liberian conservationist and the executive, as I mentioned, the executive director of SCNL for the past 13 years. He has extensive experience leading biodiversity conservation, community forestry, establishing community forestry livelihoods interventions throughout Liberia, and has been working in the Gola landscape since 2009. He led the establishment of 2 protected areas with a total of 182,000 hectares of forest. He has a strong relationship with the communities around these protected areas, enabling community leaders to consult as well as seek the needed advice about forest management issues from him. Mr. Garbo holds a BSc in General Forestry, a postgraduate certificate in Conservation and Natural Resources Management, and an MSc in Regional Science. He has been part of the UNFCCC, this is the Convention on Climate Change, Liberia's delegation to Paris, Germany, Morocco, Egypt, and Scotland. Michael has also served as a member of the steering committee for the GEF small grants in Liberia. Michael, welcome.
Thank you very much. Thank you for that good introduction. And I'll be glad, okay. I think we are very much happy to be part of this presentation today. And we just want to more or less give you some clear information on how we go about our land tenure or the land use processes in Liberia. So I'm glad to just give you the map of Liberia. This is the political map. You see that 15 counties, and you will see all along as we go further from these counties, the total draw up of the land use, you will understand. And by the same means, you will know Liberia is one of the countries that still have more forest. And in the upper Guinea forest, Liberia still hold approximately 42%. And if you come in Liberia, by forest definition, we still have about 66 million hectares of forest still intact. We can go to the next slide. Okay, as you can see, our National Forest Reform Law of 2006. You know, Liberia have gone through a civil war. So there was a forest law before 2006. But right after the war, almost everything went on disarray. So the government of Liberia, in their own wisdom at the time, set up open hands to international organizations to come in and help reform the Liberian forest sector process. So as such, in 2006, we went back to the reform law. And in this reform law, there were more things that came out that today we are working with. Especially, it was able to lay out clearly the aims of management of and conservation, defines ownership rights in forest land, regulates commercial and other forest resource use. Under the community rights law, which is also part and parcel of like a regulation to the reform law, after this, another law came up strictly for the communities, and it was the Community Right Law of 2009. And this right law empowers community to manage forest resources, their community forest, empower local communities to access, manage, use, and benefit from forest resources. Another slide. Please go ahead. Okay. Just go further. Go. Okay. Now we come to the next one is the Land Right Act. This Land Right Act, after the Forestry Reform Law of 2006, there are still been some little issues with land, community people coming up. Some people still think it was too early. Right after the war, they are not put themselves together. Some think they were not in the right state of mind, and they came up with this reform law. But then the communities wanted to know their own legal standing as regard land, as regard forest land. And then they came up with the community right law. But then, after just like 2 years ago, we again came up with the Land Right Act. And this Land Right Act is really detailing down on how communities can own their land and how they can work with government to develop or benefit from this land, and what can be the role they can play and what can be the role the government can play to improve the citizens' life. That is level intervention. So that's how the right came up. So if you look at this right, it defines the different categories of land, was well defined, the ownership and the rights in Liberia. I can speak detail on those things, and but more besides to lay out means by which each category of the land may be acquired, transfer, and managed. Because we know that in most of these areas, the communities go ahead they have the land, you have to go through the customary process. You have to own this land, and you have to be recognized by government that you own the land, and there should be a deed that is officially given to you, and it is cataloged in the archive of Liberia that you can go there and prove yourself. But most of our work, if you look at this, this is going to the forest land. And if you follow up, it will also ensure equal access and protection with respect to land ownership. And if you get to that, this is where we go about, even if you're establishing, they want to establish community forest, community land, communal land, clan land, the district ownership, everything is laid out, and then we have been following this. As you see ahead in my slides, we have used this process to come up with some of the good community forests that we can use as example as I go further. But you can also see at the end, it's also ensured that customary land and private land are given equal legal protection. So in that area, the community have the land. If you want to develop the land, you want to work on it, you want to use some of this land, you want to get access, you have to work with these communities. Next slide. We also have the categories of land ownership in Liberia. If you go to that, we got public land, government land, customary land, and private land. And you can see before them how you can get the public land. For instance, the land which is not government land, private land, or customary land. So this is a public land, and then it's for the public, and it needs to be decided on at the appropriate time so that it can be used officially. The government land, this land owned by the government, including land used for building. If you see the government land under this Land Right Act, especially for protected areas, because when this land was, this law was coming out, all areas that were owned by government, because most of these forest land was government land, in that it was like national forest. So at this cost, the national forest is owned by government, and this time it's all protected area. So if the government still want to put into full protected area, government have their own will. The customary land ownership is where the communities, the leadership, the local authorities are all participating and own this land, and they have clear, like 85 to 90% ownership on it. There's no land in Liberia is solely 100% owned. The government have percentage, and we call it the eminent domain in Liberia. And this also applies to the private land owned or otherwise held by the private persons. Next slide. Okay, we come to community right law with respect to forest land. As I said earlier, I think this is where we are now coming. If you can see, SCNL has supported communities to come up with their community forest. And this is all that we use the steps in the community right law. We are now outside of the law, we work with the community themselves play their role, and then we went to every process. If you follow up here, the community have to apply to the Forestry Development Authority that they want to now go ahead and have their own community forest. That's the procedure under the community right law. And then the Forestry Development Authority will post a salary is 30 days notice, 30 days. We post a 30 days notice for socio-economic survey, and the FDA will conduct complete socio-economic survey along with partners like FDA or other interesting partners who come and go ahead with this process, and the result will be known to stakeholders. FDA will post another 30 days notice for demarcation and mapping of the prescribed or the community land are being considered under this process. And FDA and communities will demarcate the forest, and then at the end of the day, it will now be given to the community as the community land or forest. Next slide. If you follow up with this, it's a continuation. FDA will post result of the social economic survey out. Again, it will follow up with the same 30 days so that everyone can come out. If you have a qualm, you go into it. If not, that is leading to the downward process for completion. And if you follow resolve and objections, they will wait for objection from any other persons. If there's no objection, there's nothing. The preliminary demarcation and mapping processes will go on and then leading to the community to set up a governance structure. And this shows the community how they own it, what they want to do with it. But in everything, that's why I said it's not 100%, especially for where we work with communities, there are parcel of those land set aside for conservation purpose. So if you follow up, if we go down in the SCNL supporting the normal and Tonglé to come up with their community forests that have been passed into law in 2014, is roughly around 40,000 hectares. And all of the 40,000 hectares, you see that their portion of this, like 15 to 18 thousand hectares, will have to come to conservation so that it can form part of the Gola Forest National Park and itself in the middle as a buffer, so that all of this land, maybe communities who want to get involved in logging, want to get involved in non-timber forest products harvest, they want to get in other activities and using some of these things as a log or plank, they can use as pole for building or construction, but some of this is set aside to support the protected area in Liberia. Next slide. If you follow up with the Land Rights Act, as I said, this is the newest law in Liberia and is giving detail on the communities, especially supporting the communities in their own interventions and by government. It has 6 steps. That's the Land Rights Act. Community self-identification, establishment of governance structure, boundary harmonization, customary survey of community out of the boundaries, land use management plan that is very key. It has to be done, vetting of tribal certificates and deeded private lands. So in all of these issues, if you go further down, you will see that in the land use management process, all of these processes, we are strongly working with the community because the community biggest hope is how their livelihood can be enhanced. So as such, all of the work that we are doing, livelihood is never left out because this is what they stand for. And that's why we made them to go into logging. We encourage them to stay into conservation and then be doing conservation management where they sign all that they can be given this amount and then they can keep the forest standing. So these are all of the discussions we go through. And I think these are some of the important things of the Land Rights Act. And for the presentation today, we should know that if we go into these processes, that's what we've been doing, but it's a bit costly and the communities really come up for this. They want to get some incentives and they are willing to leave the forest standing. And the government don't have that funding capacity to go on with that. And there you see most of the discussion, they ask conservation group, they ask some of us, how can we source some of this funding? How can we be supported in these activities so that we can keep the forest standing, but our activities can still go on? Next slide. I think if you follow up with the community land ownership in Liberia, we will wait for questions and answers. But as I conclude, this was the key point. They look up for their livelihood and they look up for conservation processes where you can share with them, you give them what they can manage their land with, or in the form of not buying the land, but taking ownership of some of their land, and then they can use that to enhance their livelihood. So we'll be open to questions and we can answer to some of them as we go through. Thank you for the time and thank you for looking at this presentation.
Thank you so much, Michael. That's super interesting and glad to learn of the work that's happening in Liberia. I would request our participants to keep posting on the Q&A for questions. We'll come back to questions in a moment, as we would like to hear from the other panelists first, and then we'll go into a Q&A session later on. So bear with us for now. I would like to move towards introducing Daniel. Daniel Maranvik is a South African national with 25 years of professional experience and leadership in the conservation sector, which includes supporting African countries to prioritize species, identify high-value biodiversity areas, and safeguard these sites using protected areas and other effective area-based conservation measures. Daniel's understanding of the regional and global conservation landscapes comes with a wealth of experience in a range of integrated fields, including habitat protection and management, spatial prioritization, and area-based conservation, stakeholder collaboration, grassroots and engagement and community development, and integration with development priorities. Daniel led the first national level testing of the global key biodiversity area standards and the guidance on OECM. Daniel co-led the development of the global methodology for assessing OECMs on behalf of the IUCN World Commission for Protected Areas, OECM specialist groups. Daniel, welcome.
Hi, thank you, Kiragu, and sorry, I was battling to unmute myself. I appreciate that, and thank you for inviting me to talk at this webinar on OECMs. I think it's incredibly useful and a really good timing, and it's great that I'm able to follow on from Michael, because he's really given us some concrete national examples that, in my opinion, would fit into this OECM definition and framework. So my presentation is going to have four main components. The first is I'm going to just tell you a little bit about what OECMs are and where they come from, give you some country examples, what types of OECMs we could look to find, a little bit about the regional strategy and technical resources that are available to support countries, and then wrapping up with how this speaks to 30 by 30 and the 30 by 30 ambition in the CBD. So let's start with the origins of OECMs. If we go back to the previous global biodiversity framework of the Convention on Biological Diversity, actually Target 11, which is the area-based target, spoke about covering 17% and 10% respectively of the most important places for biodiversity and ecosystem services through effectively managed and well-connected systems of protected areas and other effective area-based conservation measures. So it was in that target that it was born, but not a lot of people paid it attention. It wasn't in capitals. It didn't have a definition. We didn't really know what it was. And so countries didn't report on other effective area-based conservation measures. But it's something that we're going to have to come to grips with, because it is, in all likelihood, going to be in the new CBD target, target 3, which is currently being negotiated. You can see at the bottom of your screen. We're now talking about covering 30% of the globe. Areas of high importance for biodiversity, with a network of connected, effectively managed, and so on, systems of protected areas and OECMs. So there's going to be a pressure on countries to start identifying OECMs and reporting this to the CBD and the World Database on OECMs. It was unfortunate that it was only in 2018 that the CBD and the parties to the CBD agreed on an actual definition of an OECM. But now that they have, we have something that we can work with. And essentially the definition is as such. It's an OECM is a geographically defined area that is not a protected area. So it can't be a site that's already recognized or reported as a protected area. But it's an area which is nonetheless governed and managed in ways that achieve positive and sustained long-term outcomes for the in situ conservation of biodiversity, recognizing associated ecosystem functions and, where applicable, obviously cultural, spiritual, and socioeconomic values. So we have a very clear definition which we can now use to start identifying OECMs in the landscape. Just to quickly draw the distinction between protected areas and OECMs, and obviously privately protected areas are alongside protected areas here. Protected areas have conservation as their primary management objective. So their core function is to promote this long-term in situ conservation of biodiversity. Whereas an OECM is a site, it could be any site that's well governed and managed, that's achieving the effective in situ conservation of biodiversity, regardless of their primary management objectives. So in other words, we could have OECMs where conservation is merely an ancillary outcome. As long as there's a causal link between the management of the site and the conservation outcomes, that's okay then, if conservation is only an ancillary outcome. And these would be sites like sacred sites or sites that are used for medicinal use, protected shipwrecks, and so forth. We could then have sites where conservation is a secondary management objective. The primary management objective might be tourism or managing rangelands for livestock, or it could be a military area. But a secondary outcome or management objective is conservation of natural resources. Then we could have OECMs where conservation is the primary management objective, similar to protected areas. And really the distinction here is, what is the governance authority we want to be reported as? The IUCN would ideally like these sites to be reported as protected areas, but if for some other reason they can't be, or the governance authority doesn't want to be, then they can be recognized as an OECM. In terms of governance structures, it's the same as for protected areas. You can have 4 governance categories. Governance could be government agencies, they could be private actors, indigenous peoples and local communities, or a shared arrangement between those 3. Of course, something that we often forget is that certainly the purpose of the CBD and actually Target 11 and the new Target 3 is that we want to conserve places of high biodiversity value. That is really the primary reason for setting up protected areas and identifying OECM. So there needs to be biodiversity value at the site. In my mind, first and foremost, there needs to be biodiversity value. Otherwise, why are we investing so much resources into these sites? So the IUCN, along with, or primarily the IUCN World Commission on Protected Areas, have been developing a number of resources to support countries identify OECMs, to support sites, to assess themselves as OECMs. The first being the technical guidelines for recognizing and reporting OECMs, published in 2019 and being revised this year. Then the site level tool for identifying OECMs, version 2, was released 2 weeks ago, and that can be found on the website. And this is an assessment tool to help assess sites against the OECM criteria. And then there are a number of short films that were made on case studies from South Africa, where we ran the first national level assessment of identifying potential OECMs in the landscape. And these short films just give you a very nice taste of the types of land uses that we would be looking at. And if I could just quickly touch on 4 of those case studies, because really up until now, OECMs have been very theoretical. And what we need to do now is plant them in some empirical evidence at site level, start identifying potential OECMs in the landscape, particularly in Africa, so that we know what they look like and what we're dealing with. So just to share some from South Africa, we, after running a national process, we identified a list of potential OECMs, and we tested 9 of those in the Kruger Canyons Biosphere Reserve. And this map really illustrates, for me, one of the biggest benefits of OECMs is that it can start connecting and buffering protected areas in a mosaic conservation landscape, such as this. So you can see the interplay on the map there. One of the sites we assessed was a military Air Force base, in fact. You wouldn't think that's a likely candidate, but it was. It has its military infrastructure, but surrounding that is a lot of natural habitat, which is managed for conservation purposes, and it's managed under the Defence Force Act. So it would qualify as an OECM, and as you can see, it's situated amongst state-owned and privately owned protected areas. Then there's an academic research institute run by one of the national universities. It researches natural sciences and social sciences in the surrounding communities, but it manages its own property for conservation as well as for research purposes. The third is a state-owned forestry, commercial forestry site. And in most cases, commercial forestry wouldn't qualify as an OECM because it's not natural habitat. But in this case, amongst the commercial plantations, there are vast expanses of wetlands and grasslands in their natural habitat. And more importantly, they are creating connectivity between neighboring protected areas. So those natural habitats were assessed as OECMs and would qualify in their own right if they were mapped out of the surrounding commercial forestry areas. Then the last site I want to go into a little bit more detail is a community-owned site. We tested 3 community-owned sites in that region, but only this one qualified. And the reason is that while it has its traditional authority, which most community sites do in South Africa, it was strengthened, or it is strengthened, by 2 parallel committees, namely a community development forum and a farmers cooperative. And these 2 structures provide a platform for community members to have representation in how their livestock rangelands are managed. The underpinning policy framework is the Traditional Leaders and Governance Framework Amendment Act. But as I say, really what gives this legitimacy, this governance structure legitimacy, is that additional platforms were set up for the rest of the community to engage in the natural resource management. Then the management structure is a combination of the traditional authority and the farmers cooperative. And the communal rangelands have been set aside primarily for grazing, but community members also have access rights to subsistence, firewood, and medicinal plant collection. But what supports the management of this site is a community conservation agreement signed with Conservation South Africa, which is the South African Office of Conservation International. And they've signed an agreement with the Farmers Cooperative, and they provide technical and scientific advice to the resource users. So they help them develop a management plan, they help them manage the management plan or implement the management plan, and they've done the necessary skills training with community members. So they provide technical support and incentives for the community to continue managing these rangelands in a conservation compatible manner. Just to say that the IUCN regional office in Eastern and Southern Africa has developed a strategy to support countries with the implementation of OECMs, and I assume, hopefully, that the regional office for Western and Central Africa will do the same, develop a strategy to support countries implement OECMs. So just back to this map, you can see that in this region, South Africa, Eswatini, and Kenya are far down the road with their OECM dialogue, and Namibia, Zambia, Mozambique, Madagascar, and a few of the island states are starting the process now. So momentum is building up around OECMs in Africa. Given these country examples that we have from Africa, we've started stitching together a stepwise process that countries can follow to initiate an OECM dialogue and start identifying OECMs. This isn't a one-size-fits-all, but it can obviously be molded to the country's needs. But I just wanted to point out a couple of key components of this process. And for me, the process is really important. We've got a number of resources which I showed around technical guidance, but now if we want OECMs to meet all of their potential that they offer, it's really going to come down to the process at a country level in how we engage all the stakeholders, how inclusive we make the process, and how effectively we identify OECMs. So some of the key steps is having a national structure that can drive the process, undertaking a technical review of how OECMs align with policy and practice. Because the idea is not for OECMs to come in and duplicate or replace what's already in place, but rather to align and strengthen what's already in place. So I really liked the presentation by Michael. He outlined all the mechanisms and legislation that's in place to support those land use types. And so it would be a process of aligning OECMs with that. Having a national dialogue that's inclusive of all stakeholders in the country, allowing them to help identify a list of all the potential OECMs, and then going out and assessing a sample of those OECMs and reporting back to the national structure and stakeholders to eventually develop some kind of policy and practice roadmap. And IUCN supporting these at a country level, and it's something that we can support countries with, those that are interested in identifying OECMs. So my last slide is just about how this ties into 30 by 30. So you've already seen that it's embedded within the CBD targets, and it will be in the new targets. And the target uses protected areas and OECMs as the mechanisms to achieve 30% coverage. We want these to be in connected landscapes. We want them to be fair and effective, and we want them to be sustainable in their management and in their resourcing. We also need to be able to measure whether these sites are what they say they are. Are they effective? And there are a number of assessment tools to measure management effectiveness and governance, but I'm just going to focus in on the IUCN's Green List because, one, the Green List is a global benchmark and standard to measure effectiveness, but it also measures effectiveness across management, governance, sound design and planning, and conservation outputs. And there's a high level of assurance attached to the Green List. So it's not just about certification, but it's about a pathway to strengthen protected and conserved areas. And then with this high level of assurance, you can use it to underpin a number of benefits, because assessments aren't worth anything if they don't bring benefits to those protected and conserved areas. So we can start looking at regional challenges, for instance, human-wildlife conflicts, and how do we integrate a coexistence standard into the Green List? How do we unlock biodiversity finance through the Green List or through the OECM framework, which gives us a high level of assurance? And how do we use these to underpin nature-based solutions? For instance, the wildlife economy and others. How do we use these to strengthen our investment in nature-based solutions? So that really just kind of wraps it up in terms of the 30 by 30 ambition. And maybe just to conclude and say that, I'm aware that there's a lot of fear around the 30 by 30 targets. There's fear that it'll be business as usual, that we will replicate a lot of the history around dispossession and removing people from their lands. But that discussion for me hasn't included OECMs. And if we bring OECMs into that discussion and we use that as a key tool to recognize what local communities and other sectors are achieving around area-based conservation, to report against those and to provide them the necessary support they need to achieve their conservation outcomes, then I think OECMs can work for local communities and for the 30 by 30 ambition rather than against local communities. So I think I'll end on that note and thank you for your attention.
Wonderful. Thank you for that great presentation, Daniel. And it's a really great insights into understanding OECMs and how they are starting to play a significant role in the way land is conserved in various ways, but contributing to that greater ambition and agenda for reaching the 30 by 30 target. I see some good questions starting to roll through. We recognize and we're seeing those questions coming in. We will come to you, and I promise we'll try and respond to as many as we can at the end of the presentations. So bear with us for now as we roll into the third of these presentations. I'd like to thank you, Daniel. I'd like to introduce Kathleen. Kathleen Fitzgerald is a protected area specialist with an extensive experience in integrated large landscape conservation and development programs in Africa and North America. Kathleen has created a new protected and conserved area improved management and financial sustainability of these protected and conserved areas, establish collaborative management partnerships for protected area management in 6 countries in Africa, covering 14 million acres, and led community and climate resilience initiatives. Kathleen has helped establish the first species impact bond, established a REDD+ project, established REDD+ projects, and worked on biodiversity offset projects too. She was a partner at Conservation Capital, vice president at Africa Wildlife Foundation, and now works at the PU Charitable Trust on project finance for permanence. Kathleen is a member of the World Commission on Protected Areas Advisory Group and a senior advisor to the Global Wildlife Program at the World Bank. Kathleen, welcome.
Thanks, Kiragu. And it's really wonderful to see everyone today and the diversity of participation. So congratulations to the organizers. And thanks, Michael and Daniel, for your presentation. Michael, something you said was so relevant, and I might get this wrong, but it was essentially that the communities want to get incentives in order to keep the trees standing. And that's the key challenge is, as you know, Daniel outlined these 30 by 30 targets and the different conservation mechanisms that we might use to secure areas. How do we pay for them? How do we finance them? And how do we incentivize the conservation of these important landscapes? And so I'm going to give a couple examples of the different innovative finance mechanisms that are being used in Africa. Next slide. And while we all know the funding gap is a significant challenge in Africa, the innovation and the mechanisms being used across the continent are quite impressive. And we often, when we give examples of innovative finance models, focused on East and Southern and Central Africa. And so, Michael, given your presentation, which was fantastic, I'm going to focus on West Africa, because it's often overseen in terms of the innovation and the conservation taking place there. Next slide. So what are the different tools that are being used to finance conservation in Africa? Well, here's a very long list. And we would need an entire week to go through this. And those of you that are able to come to APAC, we will have that week to go through a number of these different finance mechanisms, which is very exciting. But for the purposes of this presentation, I'm going to focus on 5 that are being implemented across the continent. And I'm going to give you some good examples from West Africa. Next slide. The first thing before getting into innovative conservation models, and I'm a bit of a broken record on this, but allow me, indulge me for a moment. One of the key challenges that we have in Africa, whether you're talking about a community forest area, a national park, or an OECM, is how much do you need to sustain these conservation areas? And oftentimes we can't answer that question. So before delving into either approaching a donor or looking at different innovative finance models, we need to equip communities, private landowners, and public agencies with conservation area business plans. We need to figure out, number one, what the target is, what needs to be rolled out in terms of management, and what that will cost. And so I think if there are any donors who are on this panel and on this session, it's absolutely critical that we equip all the protected area management authorities with the ability to actually figure out what we need in terms of the cost to manage these conservation areas. Next slide. Once we figure out how much we need, then the next challenge is creating an enabling environment. And Michael outlined really clearly the enabling environment that exists in Liberia, which was fantastic. And while it may seem redundant to this group, critical in this is ownership. And it's quite vague in many countries. Who owns the land, who owns the natural resources, and who has rights over management? And what can they do in terms of optimizing the different economic opportunities around those natural assets? Without having clarity around those key issues, it's very difficult to delve into different innovative finance models. So again, figure out what you need to manage it, figure out who has rights over the asset, and then we can get into how to finance. Next slide. One of the tools that we have been using is for protected areas is collaborative management partnerships. And this does a couple things. Number one, it helps to create an enabling environment for investment. And number two, it helps to attract resources and investment capital. This is the cover of a report that we developed for the Global Wildlife Program of the World Bank, which is a toolkit for governments, private landowners, and communities who want to consider collaborative management partnerships, which is essentially an agreement between a management authority and a protected area partner to oversee the management of that protected area. Next slide. Often this is called a PPP. There's a lot of terms used to describe that. But one of the key things I want to highlight is this is a tool that's being used across the continent. It provides an opportunity to attract capital because it's a long-term management agreement. It brings in finance. It also brings in technical expertise. And it's not a one-size-fits-all. There are 3 different models that are used, and we profile these 3 in the toolkit: a bilateral, integrated, or delegated management agreement. And again, what this does is it enables governments, it enables communities and private landowners to determine the best management model that's needed to secure management effectiveness in their protected areas. Next slide. And what we have found with collaborative management partnership, as I mentioned, is we analyzed 40 of these collaborative management partnerships across Africa, and we found ecological increase. We found an increase in economic drivers. We found an increase in capacity, and we also found an increase in operational efficiencies. There's a couple examples here, one from Akagera National Park. You can see an increase in salaries as well as tax revenue to the government. And then in the bottom from Malawi, and I see someone is on the line here from Malawi, we saw an increase in community development spending in Majeti National Park in Malawi. So again, these tools, collaborative management partnerships, incredible way to increase management effectiveness, to transfer capacity, as well as incentivize investment. Next slide. And we see this tool, as I mentioned, across Africa. And this is a map, again, of the 40 collaborative management partnerships that we analyzed. And you can see a number of these in West Africa. At the bottom, in the bottom left, you can see the pipeline of collaborative management partnerships that are under active development. There is a very robust pipeline of collaborative management partnerships across the continent. So we're going to continue to see more and more CMPs across the continent. Next slide. The second tool I want to mention, which I think presents an enormous opportunity across the continent, in particular in West Africa, are biodiversity offsets. Next slide. So according to IUCN, a biodiversity offset, I'm going to read their definition, is a measurable conservation outcome that results from actions designed to compensate for adverse or unavoidable residual biodiversity loss from impactful projects. All of you living in Africa know that the pace of development is continuing to increase. Mining, resource extraction, road development, railway development, and the opportunity to engage with the corporate sector, the private sector, and governments around biodiversity offsets is significant. Now, IUCN has some great toolkits around biodiversity offsets. I would encourage you to take a look at that. And I'm going to oversimplify this, but essentially it's engaging with corporate partners to offset that impact using the mitigation hierarchy. So avoiding, minimizing, restoring, and then offsetting. And the chart at the bottom of this slide shows an increase in policy and legislation around offsets. So if you're a mining company, why are you going to offset? In some countries, you are legally required to offset, whereas in other countries, perhaps it's the funders like IFC that are requiring you to offset. Next slide. So the two examples I want to give, number one is from Senegal, and this is in Niokolo-Koba National Park, which is the second largest national park in West Africa. And you can see on the top there, it's that blue in the southern part of the country. There's a gold mining company operating outside of the protected area, and they have developed a biodiversity offset inside and around Niokolo-Koba National Park. The offset is being used to finance conservation management inside the park, as well as community development outside of the park. A very good example of a biodiversity offset. Next slide. Another example from West Africa is in Guinea. And this is Moyen-Bafing National Park, which is a new national park recently created, and it is the result of a biodiversity offset from two mining companies. This is an extremely important chimpanzee habitat, and the offset was used not only to create the national park, but to continue to finance the national park and community development around the park. So two examples of offsets. Next slide. Aggregate offsets, and certainly Michael will know more about this from Liberia, but I do want to flag this. The two examples I gave you are site specific, where you have a mining company in both cases that chose to, or were required to, because of their funding, offset their impact. And they did so in a particular area. An aggregate offset is planning one or more relatively large offsets that would engage multiple private sector partners. So for example, and there was a study done in Liberia looking at aggregate offsets. If a country wanted to be proactive and look at their conservation targets and create an aggregate offset, what that would mean is multiple companies would finance that focal conservation area. And that would result in reduced transaction costs, adequate conservation funding, because you'd have pooled resources towards a targeted area. It would help with site selection. It would reduce delays. And again, this would be done under government leadership to design a proactive conservation strategy, identifying targets, and again, pooling these resources. So I think that's a huge opportunity for many countries in Africa. Next slide. Next is a conservation agreement, which is linked to biodiversity offsets. And we heard Daniel talking about conservation agreements in South Africa. So it's another opportunity to engage with private sector partners. And I see Fiestra is on this call from the African Wildlife Foundation, and African Wildlife Foundation has used conservation agreements in many cases, for example, in southern Tanzania with an avocado company. So there are examples where you have corporate partners who were not required to offset, but they want to engage in conservation. This is a great opportunity to engage corporates with conservation agreements. Next slide. Conservation Capital did some work with CEPF looking at conservation agreements. Basically, it's a voluntary covenant between parties who agree to the same conservation goals, whereby one party provides an incentive to the other for the protection of that focal area. And you can see on this slide, there are many drivers for why the different stakeholders and partners would be involved in a conservation agreement. And I suspect that Michael is very familiar with this because this is a tool being used in Liberia. Again, if you have a company and they're interested in financing conservation or community development, they enter into a conservation agreement with that stakeholder. They agree to incentivize conservation outcomes, and the partner, maybe it's communities, maybe it's an NGO, maybe it's a protected area authority, implements that conservation activity or community development activity. Next slide. One of the mechanisms, and I'll mention this a little bit later, but one of the mechanisms used around conservation biodiversity offsets as well as conservation agreements involves conservation trust funds. So I just wanted to flag that. Next slide. The next example is payment for ecosystem services, and we're seeing the use of PES, as they're called, around the continent. And I want to give you an example from West Africa. Next slide, please. So as most people know on this webinar, payment for ecosystem services occurs when a beneficiary or a user of an ecosystem service makes a direct or indirect payment to the provider. And I'm sure many of you have seen this image, right? You've got the upstream community who are stewarding the forest, which is protecting the watershed. And then in the downstream, you have the users. And theoretically, the way it would work is the users pay the upstream community to protect the asset that they're securing. Next slide. And we're seeing examples of this through water as well as carbon. There are other, of course, PESs being developed, but those are the two most viable that are commercially operating in Africa. And I want to give you an example here. We've been doing some work in Ivory Coast, and this is a great example, Banco National Park, which is in Abidjan, a sweet little park right in the capital. The capital has a population of 5.5 million people. 40% of the water for the population comes from this park. So it's a perfect example of where the users could pay to support the protection of this forest, which is providing water for the capital and even beyond. And the Protected Area Authority in Ivory Coast is looking at that. They're also looking at potential corporate partnerships for a PES scheme. Next slide. The other example I want to give in West Africa is around carbon. And this is a carbon project that was developed by the government of Guinea-Bissau in partnership with the BioGuinea Foundation. It's a blue carbon and a green carbon project that's focused on two conservation areas in the coastal area of Guinea-Bissau. It's verified and validated through Vera, and they have partnered with the Everland Corporation, which is helping to market and sell their carbon credits, which they've successfully sold, and it's now financing the management of these protected areas as well as community development in and around these protected areas. What most people don't know about Guinea-Bissau is amazing community governance models for their protected areas. So the communities have been very much a part of the development of this RED project and as beneficiaries. Next slide, please. Project finance for permanence. Kiragu mentioned this in his kind introduction, and this is something that I'm focusing on right now. And next slide, please. This is a new mechanism for Africa, and it's something that we're looking at exploring around the continent and around the globe. And it's essentially an approach that pools together a bunch of different resources and finance structures into a single closing so that we can leverage conservation funding, leverage innovation, leverage policy change. This has been used in 5 other places around the globe. And the focus is really to look at durable conservation, durable community impact, and to look at how to bring resources together to leverage long-term durable finance. And so I think we'll be hearing more about this. And those of you coming to APAC may hear about this as well. Next slide. I'm going to skip that because I'm running short on time. Lastly, conservation trust funds. I mentioned this as a tool that's being used for aggregate biodiversity offsets. Next slide. It is a tool that's being used around Africa. It's a mechanism to manage financial resources, but it's also a mechanism that enables innovation. And what I mean by that is the countries, for example, in Mozambique that have a conservation trust fund, when you speak with them, they say, having that CTF, having those resources to pay basic costs like rangers and equipment and operation, it allows us to be creative and innovative, right? Most of you on this call that are involved with conservation, from a day-to-day perspective, you're trying to figure out how to pay the managers on the ground, how to pay the operational costs. A CTF gives you the flexibility to be creative. Next slide. And we've seen a number of these around the world. There are 108 worldwide. And these are 4 examples from West Africa, 4 CTFs that exist and are operational and functioning in West Africa. Next slide. So that was a smattering, as always, of different finance mechanisms that are being used around the continent, with some specific examples in West Africa. And the last point I want to make, and I hope you got this from this presentation, is there's incredible innovation taking place around Africa. And the challenge now is scaling those up and replicating them to meet the 30 by 30 targets. So thanks, Kiragu.
Wow, what a wonderful presentation. Thank you, Kathleen. And I always feel like I'm learning new things whenever we hear from you. It's just fantastic to hear the kind of things that are happening. We are now going to open to questions. I will first of all start with the few that are already mentioned on the chat Q&A. Please, I encourage participants to log questions on the Q&A as opposed to the chat space. The first question is more or less to Michael, I think, which is from Kolu Zigby. Thank you, Kolu, for joining us today. Great to see you here. So Kolu wants to know, what's the cost of carrying out the process in Liberia, and how it is paid for and supported so that low-income rural communities can afford to carry out the process of going through, I think, the Community Land Right Act. Michael, are you able to respond to that?
Yes, and I want to say thanks to Kolu for that brilliant question. But I want you to know that it's a bit costly. If you go directly to establishing a community forest using the 9 steps, the community right law, there's nothing less than 180,000 you will spend from step 1 to step 9, because there's steps that you have to also support the government agency to get into the communities to work on these things. But if you are including the institution outside of the government are helping to establish this and looking at livelihood, getting the communities involved, logistics, and following up everything, you should be going around 600,000 to 800,000. So it's not an easy cost, and this is where the communities have to look whether they will get it before or they share it as a benefit that they can get if they work and establish it so that they keep it standing and get our costs up.
Michael, we're talking about 180.
That's why we always like to work with. We like to work with organizations. We get the communities involved, get institutions, get organizations. The UC, the EU, BirdLife have been happy, IUCN, and looking at other institutions to help the communities provide us funding through projects so that we can get to it before they start getting the benefit out. Thank you.
And just to clarify, we're talking about 180 to 600,000 US dollars.
US dollars, US dollars.
Quite a cost to rural communities, I can understand. And as you say, you're involving national and international NGOs to facilitate the communities. So I presume then that organizations like yours, SCNL, are able to help with the preliminary review for the communities to ensure that if you start off with that process, then there's a likeliness to achieve that outcome. Is that correct?
Sure, sure.
Fantastic.
That's why we stand in a gap for those communities, and then we work directly with the communities to go through the process.
Thank you for that clarification. Ephraim Lombe wanted to know the overlaps between, again, back to you, Michael, customary and public lands. Are you able to clarify that for him?
Yes, if you go to the customary land, is strictly for the local communities that are in the area that have lived there for their lifetime. So they have that customary right because they were there before even Liberia came into being or before government started putting political boundaries. So they have that customary right to it. The public land is after the government have established these political boundaries and then come to the point that this is a public land, it's outside of the government land, it's outside of the customary land. So it's a land that somebody can presume ownership if you want to go to make it your private land because you could get some for building or for farming. For this, so it's a public land that anyone could still work on procedures and get into it.
Great, thank you. There's a question around protected areas, whether they fall under public lands. If I got it correct, you say that under government lands, but if I'm wrong, please clarify. But more or less, you could also qualify what percentage of protected areas in Liberia. What is the percentage of protected areas in Liberia as well when you're answering that?
Okay, thank you. And just before I get to that, I just want you to know that when you see the public land could be changed into government land, customary land, or any of the other processes. But once it's a public land, it's open, and you could put it into what you want it to be following the referral procedure. If you come to the protected area in Liberia, as you may be aware, the government of Liberia set aside 30% of forest land for conservation or protected area purpose. And that 30% from the forest definition now of Liberia, as you may be aware, Liberia got 6 million hectares of forest intact. And 30% of that amount is around 1.8 million hectares. But then what we have into protected areas now, out of the 30%, we have like 12% on protection by law. So we still got more to do, but this requires funding, this requires support, this requires government support to gain the 30%.
Mm-hmm. Great to hear that. Thank you. I've got a couple of questions for you, Kathleen, from Zainab and Harmony. It's wanting to know how adequate, question is, how do you make adequate conservation funding possible? Because grants for community-based conservation work is so competitive and hard to get, especially by community-based organizations. And then regarding the offsets, how does there not need to be an uplift? I think it's about whether we should have an uplift where we're dealing with offsets. So investors are not investing in an area that is already protected. So what is the additional value, I suppose, added value in offsets to protected areas?
Unmute there. To that second question, that's a great question. And additionality is an absolute requirement for biodiversity offsets, right? So, and you said it well here, an offset is not an offset if essentially it's status, right? So when engaging in a biodiversity offset, the company needs to demonstrate additionality. So for example, with Neokolo-Koba National Park, you're 100% correct. In that example that I gave, the park already exists. However, we could demonstrate a lack of effective management in that protected area. And in the buffer zone of that protected area, there was a lack of land use planning, as well as community development to provide them with the incentive to reduce the impact on unsustainable utilization of natural resources. So in that case, the offset, the additionality was enhancing effective management as well as land use plans, which protected more areas and community development. In that second example, in Guinea, the offset actually created a new protected area. So that was a significant additionality. But that's a very clear requirement with offsets. And it's a very important point because offsets sometimes are looked at as kind of greenwashing, and being able to demonstrate that additionality as well as measuring those outcomes on an annual basis is absolutely critical. Zainab, I think your question is focused mainly around community-based conservation, if I'm interpreting that correctly. And I think Michael's presentation and Daniel's is relevant to that because it's essentially decentralizing certain rights to communities, be it land or rights over those natural resources. And in my opinion, that's the first way to really galvanize resources for communities because they are the stewards of those areas. And by being those stewards, whether it's customary or legally within the contemporary legal framework, they have a seat at the table. And so they need to engage in any development taking place. The example that I gave you of Guinea-Bissau and that RED project, because the communities have rights over land, because the communities are part of that governance structure, they are part of that RED project. They are beneficiaries. So part of the RED finance coming out of that project is going to the community-based organizations that have governance rights as well as management rights over certain areas. So I think that's the first key thing is a clarity of rights.
Brilliant, brilliant. Thanks, Kathleen. I'll jump to Daniel, come back, and then I'll come back to you again, Kathleen. Daniel, I know that you've responded to a couple of questions already directly to the participants, to some participants, but I wanted to ask a general question as well around reporting for OECMs and how is that handled at national level where this mechanism is already started to show up in the countries that you're working in Africa, and who takes the lead in recognizing OECMs in countries?
Thanks, Kiragu. It's a really good question and something that's not necessarily well defined yet at a global level. So we're kind of figuring it out as we go at a national level. I can give you two examples, one from South Africa and the other one from Kenya. And in fact, they're fairly similar. South Africa is a bit more advanced because we started this process 4 years ago. But essentially what we did was we had the national stakeholder engagement, presented OECMs, made sure everyone understood what OECMs are. We undertook a technical review of how well they aligned with policy and practice. And then we set up a working group of key stakeholder representative bodies and structures to continue driving the OECM process in country. And on that working group were key NGO role players, but also the state, who's ultimately responsible for reporting OECMs and building OECMs into policy. So we supported them in parallel to the sort of broader national process, and supported them to take OECMs through the different political structures and to present it there, ultimately to come out with some kind of policy position on OECMs. And a lot of the feedback they got from the state agencies especially was, well, who's going to pay for this? We already have limited resources for protected areas, and how are we going to review all these sites that are going to be assessed and report them? So what we did is raised funding to undertake a provincial level assessment that really looked at obviously all the potential OECMs in that landscape, but then also started to quantify the financial and human resource needs to go out and assess all these potential OECMs and look for opportunities to align with existing processes. So in South Africa, we've got biodiversity stewardship, very strong processes in place already that we can align with. In Kenya, they're undertaking a very similar process, but I think the point that I'm trying to make is that at this stage, until there's more guidance, and even that guidance is going to be fairly broad, one has to look for these opportunities at a national level. So what's already in place in terms of reviewing private protected area applications or community conservancies? I think you'll find in most countries there are already some really strong structures in place, particularly associations that represent community conservancies or local communities. And I think the idea would be to align with them and give them the mandate to review site assessments. And in terms of resourcing it, I think that's a question that Kathleen has started to answer, but again, it's something you've got to work out at a national level. And the more you can integrate OECMs into some sort of policy framework, the easier it is to then leverage those resources.
Brilliant, brilliant. And just to dovetail on that, once an OECM is recognized, and I guess when you're saying we, you meant ILCN office facilitating these conversations at the national level. I was curious to know whether once a site is recognized, officially recognized as an OECM, considering that biodiversity is a secondary goal, is there any expectation or requirement to have a biodiversity management plan for that site? Is there any expectation?
Yeah, a good question. And the short answer is no. As an OECM, you don't have to have a stringent management plan in place. There need to be management objectives, and you need to be able to demonstrate that you're implementing these management objectives, but you don't have to have an 80-page management plan written out and shelved and gathering dust. But you need to be able to illustrate that through the site's management, there are conservation outcomes being produced at the other end. And just to maybe remind everyone that what we're trying to do with OECMs is we're not trying to go out there and establish OECMs in the landscape. It's not like establishing protected areas. We're trying to go out there and recognize what's already in place, what's already being done, the governance that's already there. We're not trying to create something new. And I think that's quite a big distinction.
Absolutely. It's value addition to what is already there, as opposed to creating new systems.
Daniel, Kiragu, can I intervene and ask Daniel a follow-up question on that? Daniel, if an OECM is providing ecosystem services in some way and getting compensated for that, is there a way in the framework that you've got, or does it have to be in addition to the framework that you've got, to periodically audit that OECM, even in the absence of a management plan, to confirm that the ecosystem services are being produced? I hope that made sense.
Yeah, it did. Again, there's no global guidance for how often OECMs need to be reassessed. So we don't know what that's going to look like, if it'll be every 5 years or every 10 years, but we do need something that, forces us to go back and make sure those conditions are still in place, and it's an OECM. But in the example you gave, Jim, I think, whoever's paying for those ecosystem services, it's probably best to write it into that agreement, some sort of, monitoring and evaluation or review process.
Thank you. That's helpful.
Sorry, thank you, Daniel. Let me just jump back to a question. I think Kathleen responding to, I think Zainab, Harmony also responded to the question that Hanan had posed. So I'll jump to a question by Fiesta. which is around the initial cost of undertaking assessment for some of the payments for ecosystem services projects, for example, RED Plus, are extremely high. She's just wondering if there are any mechanisms and approaches that have been developed to reduce this costs.
Yeah, it's a really great question, Fiesta. And many of you are aware, for example, developing a RED project, a carbon offset project, it's expensive because you need to verify it. You need to demonstrate additionality. And so that is quite expensive. Similarly with PES, so for example, that water project from Banco National Park in Ivory Coast that I gave you, you need to actually demonstrate the value that forest is providing to the water, the outflows, the volume, etc. And that's expensive. So the bad news, Fiesta, is no. I'm not aware of cost reductions in terms of developing those projects. But the good news is two things. Number one, we have a lot of examples of RED and PES projects, so we can be more efficient because we've made mistakes and we've demonstrated what works and doesn't work. So I think there's more efficiency in developing these projects. Number two, there are significant resources available to develop these projects, in particular around RED. 10 years ago, when we were developing RED projects, finding the upfront capital to develop those projects was very difficult. Now, to be honest, there are companies kind of banging down the door trying to find good projects to finance. So there is great opportunity right now to develop RED projects in particular, and blue carbon projects even more so. The project that I mentioned in Guinea-Bissau, our blue credit sold for twice as much as the green because of the demand for blue carbon. So there's a huge opportunity right now across the continent.
Roger, you're muted.
Sorry, thank you. Thank you. Thanks, Jim. Moving on to a question by Anthony. Daniel, how long these management objectives should be? I think the question is around the management objective for the sites that are recognized. Are there particular expectations around their validity?
Are we talking about the length of time that a governance structure or management needs to be in place, or the period that a management plan covers?
Yes, I think that's a context really. How long should the management, just very quickly because we're about to wrap up.
Yeah. Okay, sure. So yeah, this is $1 million question because the definition talks about long-term and sustained. So what does that mean? And countries interpret it differently. In South Africa, we talk about 99 years or into perpetuity. Others talk about 35 years. So the way we've dealt with this at a global level is to say that there should be no foreseeable end to the governance structure or the management implementation at the site. I mean, a management plan can be for 5 years, 10 years, it doesn't matter, but the intention to continue managing it like that, and the governance structure should have no foreseeable end in sight.
Super, thank you. Thank you. I'm afraid we've run out of time, and it's been such an engaging session. I've loved every minute of it, and it's been an amazing opportunity to learn from our panelists. I want to really say a heartfelt thank you so much for providing us with the opportunity to learn from you, hear the examples of Liberia, hear how OECMs are contributing to expanding this, reaching a target for 30 by 30 for governments, and to Kathleen for enlightening us about the opportunities available for funding. I want to again mention that these conversations are part of an ongoing series of webinars, which we're hoping that you can join us for the next one in June. We had from East Africa and Southern Africa in April, and this now was an opportunity to learn about what else is happening in the continent. And I want to thank my colleagues at the ILCN for helping to facilitate this webinar to happen. So thank you very much, and back to you, Jim.
Well, I just want to reiterate how appreciative we are. This is a good demonstration, this webinar and the one prior, of how much creative conservation work is going on right now on the African continent. I know that you all are going to convene at least one more time, I think before the African Protected Areas Congress, which is in July in Uganda.
Rwanda.
And Rwanda, I'm sorry, I messed that up the other day. I messed it up again today. But in any case, I know that there will be an ILCN representative there. And let me refer all of you to the ILCN website. Again, it's www.landconservationnetwork.org for the recording of the prior webinar, this webinar, and the webinars to come. I wish you all Godspeed. You're doing tremendous work. And for all of you around the world, have a great day. And we will see you again very soon. Thank you.
Thank you very much. All the very best to everyone.